Many of you are sitting where you get a whole symphony of cell phone rings. And would I please ask you all to turn off your cell phones? It's the quietest it's been around here all day. Question time. Are some people ready? We're right on schedule. There were 3 or 4 people left this morning, and I think if they came by, we could give them priority. But here's one right now.
How do your traditions' understanding of the hereafter shape your community's encounter with modernism?
Any question?
It's a wonderful question. How do our traditions reckon with the idea of hereafter, the hereafter, and in what way does that reflect on modernism? You know, one of the things that I'm no expert on this, but my sense is that one of the notes of modernity is that human beings became aware in a fresh way of the fact that they're using language. It's related to the revolution in language that took place with the vernacular, the invention of vernacular languages, related to the Reformation, therefore, and so on. But in the modern period, we began to think about the words we use independently of the meaning they have. So I'm speaking to you right now. Let me draw attention to the words I'm using. The words I'm using stand between you and me. And if we have a bond between us, it depends on the words that I'm using. And these words are not actually me. They aren't what I mean. They don't successfully convey what I mean. And when they are received by you, they aren't you either. You and I are independent of the words. Religious language, all religion is essentially words. It's language. What is religion? Religion is language about God. It isn't God. We intuitively, as religious people, have an instinct about the meaning of our experience that it is beyond anything we can explain. I am alive in a way today that has so much depth and I'm so aware of it that I know that something of what's alive in me is permanent. That's the experience. Something of what's alive in me. This couldn't, I know that there are people who don't think this way, but as a religious person, this consciousness I have points beyond itself. That's the experience. And religious language has invented a series of images and symbols and metaphors to get at what's that beyond. And one of them is a division in our experience of time. There's now and there's then. There's this moment now, and then there's that moment then. There's this life now, and then there's that other life after. We know nothing about what's called the afterlife. The afterlife is not about heaven, hell, or purgatory. The afterlife is an affirmation about the experience of life I'm having right now. That my life right now is too deep for normal language. It goes forever in some way. Eternal life is now. And this moment now requires the idea of an afterlife. But it isn't the afterlife that I'm talking about. So I'm not actually thinking about what happens to me after I die. I am thinking about what's happening to me now. And I firmly believe that the depth of this experience now is the opening to the Holy One. I don't have faith in my immortal soul. I don't have faith in heaven. I don't have faith in the afterlife. I have faith in the Holy One, whose promise to me is unbreakable, as Paul says, even by death. So and let me just say that the language about the afterlife is beautiful language, and I affirm it. So I'm happy to talk about heaven. Less happy to talk about hell, but I understand why we have the idea of hell, because what is hell? Hell is the image we have for the complete defeat of human freedom, which is an option that each of us has. Modernity has given us a much richer notion of the language we're using, of the limits of it, and the possibilities of it. And the biblical tradition is so rich because we can return to the biblical tradition, or if we're in Rabbinic Judaism, through the interpretation and the commentary of centuries and centuries, and uncover ways in which our fathers and mothers in the faith have had this experience before. I hear this kind of approach to afterlife running all through Jesus of Nazareth, who talks constantly about the kingdom of God is within you. It is now that you are alive to God, not then. Life. I have come that you might have life, life to the full here, and not even death defeats it. So modernity is yet another chapter in the ongoing story of human consciousness coming into awareness. And if we're lucky, our awareness grows and grows, although we also understand the original sin of modernity, that our awareness can also become forgetfulness, and we can forget. We can lose the tradition, as Vince reminds us. And the ideal is to constantly retrieve the tradition, but always in a new way based on our new experience.
We have 5 questioners in 15 minutes, so we're going to push ahead. Thank you very much, and to other respondents.
You know, I'm going to ask the question, answer the question with a question. What's hereafter? What is the afterlife? In other words, we'd first have to define what is the afterlife in order to reflect on, or ask how does it reflect on modernism, and Jim just gave a take on it. The only, just 2 brief things. One is that we have to be very, very careful not to use notions of the afterlife as the place in which that which we know to be corrupt here is made kosher. Things that you wouldn't do here. You know, because what happens is here you're rubbing elbows with others. In the afterlife, everybody is Catholic. No, you know, it's like this is, and therefore it's like.
That's why we're all so happy.
It's like, and you think, and what happens is that there's things that we wouldn't get through an Americanization of religion now. We allow to exist in our beliefs in the afterlife, and in so doing, allow the perpetuation of cancer in our midst. That's one thing about, and so if we're committed to a religious modern agenda, we also have to redefine what we yearn for. You can't yearn for one thing in this world and then create a completely different standard for the next world without believing that it's not going to trickle down to the way you live your everyday life now. Do you know what? Because of shortness of time, I'll stop with that.
I need to say something very quickly also. It's too important a question. In traditional Islam, there is a very, very, very strong importance given to the afterlife. There used to be a whole genre of literature called kutub at-tawahum in Arabic. It's books of imaginings or fantasies or sort of visions of the afterlife, and most of them tended to be negative. It's mostly what happens when you're bad and you go to hell, and they're very lurid descriptions of what happens to you. Even Muhasibi, the person I talked about a minute ago, he wrote one of those things, and there are less of them, but there are books about heaven as well. And but I wanted to say about this point, because it touches on the issue of martyrdom, which is very important, obviously, to people in thinking about Islam today. first of all, what is going to be there in the afterlife in terms of the descriptions and discussions in the Quran and tradition is not entirely clear. You've heard a lot on the news about the so-called 72 virgins. The Quran is not talking about 72 human, female, nubile, Pamela Anderson virgins. The word huri in Arabic comes, it's related to the concept of hur al-ain, which literally is the iris of the eye. It's like something very fine, very beautiful, very sublime. It's a sort of it's a mystery in the Quran, is a good way to put it. And there is a sort of simplistic tradition that, you know, tries to get people to think of the afterlife by sort of jazzing it up and if I can use this term, sexing it up a little bit, so that it becomes particularly appealing to adolescent young men. And one of the things that I do in my spare time, but you know, I don't do it too much because I get really depressed, is I sometimes watch jihad videos. And I watch them from all over the Muslim world, and what's really striking about them is that they're all written for, or they're all made for adolescent young men. Perhaps the best one is there's one from Chechnya that I saw. I showed it in a class last year. It ends with a picture of a jaguar with the Chechen's flag on it and a Chechen mujahid, a fighter for the faith, you know, in the famous James Bond pose, you know, on the James Bond posters. I mean, this is what they're pitching to. I mean, these, you know, the people who are the suicide bombers, the jihadists, many of them are, I mean, they're the recipients, they're the pawns, if you will, of a propaganda campaign that uses these simplistic views of the afterlife to, again, to sort of, you know, like Donniel says, lure them away from this imperfect, unhappy world into something greater in the hereafter. And of course, what they're playing on is the Islamic tradition that anyone who dies fighting for the cause of truth, the jihad is really for the cause of truth, not just Islam, goes immediately to heaven. This is also in the Quran itself. A suicide bomber is not a traditional person. Suicide bombing is nothing that happened in pre-modern Islam. If you want to find the most egregious example of modernism in Islam today, it's the suicide bombing. Because, first of all, suicide is wrong in Islam. Killing innocents is arguably wrong in Islam. But the most important thing that's wrong about suicide bombing from a theological point of view is that no martyr has the right, and this is in Islam as well as Christianity as well as Judaism, to say, I'm going to die 100%. The martyr is chosen by God. The martyr is not the person who self-selects. And so anybody who blows himself up knowing that he's going to die is someone who is basically a nihilist. And that is what the great, I mean, apart from the sins of killing innocents, that's the great sin in suicide bombing. Because, again, there are lots of martyrs in all three religions. People could go and do something incredibly brave, knowing the chance might be 999 times out of 1,000 they're going to die. But there's always that 1 in 1,000. Sometimes God chooses not to take those lives. God chooses to make them examples for others through their life. And that's what the suicide bomber forgets.
I think you were next, and then first in that line next. Please.
I'm of the same generation as James, and so I recognize much of what he said, as well as the fact that some history professors say Americanism is the phantom heresy. But nevertheless, it has affected all of us. My question to the group is this. Jim, where you said experience over doctrine, I would like to know how the others in the group relate to that reality in their traditions, and how it might relate, and this is a little bit specialized, I realize, is to David Tracy's correlation theology of experience and tradition. That's my question.
Jim, you want to start that one? It was directly to you, and hear the other two?
I'd welcome, you know, I recognize as Donniel actually went right to the heart of this in his response, which is we all can quickly be attuned to the danger in such an idea. Tradition in human history has been a shield against what threatens and what kills. Traditions are a humane way in which one generation takes advantage of the experience of previous generations. So to be contemptuous of tradition is to miss the point. That isn't the point. It's to understand in a fuller way what tradition is. Tradition is experience. So the tradition that says in my own Catholic church that only males can be ordained is a tradition rooted in the experience of a patriarchal culture that took for granted male power as the humane way to organize society. And in prehistory, there may have been good reasons for that. I don't know. It's hard to imagine it from our point of view. But there were reasons why patriarchal societies organized themselves the way they did. So, and let's grant the possibility that the traditions that we are moving away from now had in their origins experience that human beings found valuable. But the other wonderful lesson that we Christians need continually to take from the religious tradition of Rabbinic Judaism is that religious reflection is by definition interpretation, reinterpretation, memory, returning to the text, and understanding that the returning to the text and the reinterpretation of the text is itself a sacred act, which is why Talmud is sacred text on the same shelf as Torah, if I can presume to speak from a Christian point of view. So that tradition is human experience. When we want to repudiate tradition is when it's lost its purpose, it begins to violate what it was there for in the first place. And the best example of that I can think of is the tradition of male supremacy that is time to let go of.
It's such a great question, and I'm tempted to answer it in a 4-hour response. But in the spirit of Hillel, while I stand on one foot, there is a commandment in Judaism. One of the 613 commandments is not to desecrate God's name. And that is defined in our tradition as the most heinous crime that if a person does, they cannot achieve atonement in this life, but rather only repentance and death will create a sense of atonement. And the rabbis then ask, so what is this, if this is the bad one, this is sort of the one you have to know about. It's the other ones aren't so important. This one you have to make sure you don't get wrong. Now, this desecrating God's name has many sides to it. Like, if you think, how could we desecrate God's name? Isn't God, who are we? How could you do anything to God? At most, you can fail, but no, the rabbis say you can desecrate God's name. And what they explain is that the commandment to desecrate God's name is ultimately based on the fact that God chose this world to be the world in which God walks. The God of transcendence chooses to not be an Aristotelian God and to contemplate God's navel, but rather chooses us, wants to be known amongst us, wants us to love God, wants us to care about God. Why? We don't have a clue. Why should a transcendent God care about us? But in the act of revelation, God is empowering, and more than empowering, valuing who we are. God wants you. God actually cares what you think about God. Now think about that for a moment. And so what the rabbis then do is they create the notion that one of the central duties of religious life is to worry also about perception, how things are perceived, what happens and what you do. Now, on the issue of experience, where does this come in? And here I'll use a slightly different language than Jim. I don't know if tradition is experience. It's no doubt also founded on experience. But experience must be a corrective to tradition, knowing sometimes that we're stepping beyond what tradition originally intended, because, and the source of the authority of experience is that being whom God chose to want to be sanctified in their midst, and that is you. And as a Jew, since I don't, and I don't want to, again, I want to be very careful, I'm not saying I don't have an experience of original sin. I don't have an experience of humanity by definition getting it wrong. Quite to the contrary. The commandment to not desecrate God's name, and the reverse is to sanctify God's name, is an affirmation of the value of who we are. And therefore our experiences, the truths that we rediscover, the things that we learn as we progress through history, are voices that I could not ignore without undermining the value of the human being whom God has given, if not infinite, extreme importance to.
Yeah, I'll try to give a Hillel answer also. The Quran says, "Inna al-insana la yatra in ra'ahu istaghrana," says, "Verily the human being transgresses because he sees himself as self-sufficient." This, I think, is the Quranic problem with modernity. If you think of modernity as what I call the Richard Dawkins effect, that type of atheism, the sense that we have come so far and so fast and advanced technologically and scientifically so much that we can dispense with the need for God. The Quran answers that by saying, Allahu ghani wa antum al-fuqara. God is the self-sufficient, you are the poor, meaning in need of God. And that's why there's a long tradition, for example, among the Sufis of calling themselves the fuqara, the poor. They're not poor because necessarily they're poor economically. They're constantly aware of their need for God. And that, I think, is enough to guard us against the most pernicious effects of modernity. That, we have come far. We have advanced to the point scientifically where we can understand the physical universe and our place in it far more than anyone could ever have dreamt in the time of the Prophet Muhammad or in the medieval period or even 50 years ago. Yet, as the Quran always says, to me the main message of the Quran is you better figure out that God exists, because one way or the other you're going to find out, either now or later. And so get wise. In other words, get smart enough to have a crisis of faith. And that reality is still with us, and that's why religions are still with us. There are questions that science is not able to answer, and probably there always will be. And that itself, I think, is enough, and the rest can work itself out.
Question over here, please.
This has a lot to do with the loss of barriers and assimilation, mostly to do with Donniel, what you talked about. Do you feel that the identity crisis and modernity, the loss of barriers, with the cost-benefit analysis where people pick and choose the lenses in which they adhere to or see things through, do you think that will lead to either one, a single unified identity, or two, like a set of less distinguishable, less boundary-bidden concentric circles, a sort of coexistence of identity ideals that is based on assimilation and rationalized by modernity, or something else?
Okay, got several options. He asked you, Rabbi.
I thought in the spirit, I don't know. It's a great question. It's up to us. That's where it depends if we do our job right. It depends if religious leaders do our job right. I don't believe it'll ever lead to a single unified identity. I think we as human beings, I don't think that's a temptation. I think we are so diverse that it's not simply that we need somebody different around us. We hear things, our experiences are so different. The multiple complex identities, I don't think, are going to create a new larger singular. whether it will create something, to use your language, of such total superficiality, it seems to be going in that direction. And people who are fighting against that superficiality, we call them fundamentalists or whatever, what they try to do is to create a singular identity. That is, I would say, one of the agendas of religious fundamentalism, is to create one source, which is the total authority, where you're silent, where you're able to silence all the other voices which claim you. And it's again, in the spirit of what was, of the remarks of my colleagues, if I don't want to go back to a singular identity, in other words, modernity changed the rules not just by giving us a reality, like if I could perpetuate Judaism by becoming ultra-Orthodox, as the Haredi, the ultra-Orthodox ideology is ultimately an attempt to recreate a singular identity. Close out the rest of the world, don't see them, recreate on your own ghettos, break with the world, dress differently, act differently. If too many people keep kosher like you, there's something wrong with your kashrut. You need to change your kosher so that the goal of kosher is that nobody could eat with you. And even Jews, it's a whole process, and it's to get you down to, and ultimately also you create sources of authority. The authoritarian figure says, only listen to me. We could create, in the middle of a modern world, this type of ghetto. I wouldn't want to go there. The game that I want to play is a dangerous one, though. And that is, I want to live with these complex identities, but I want them to be catalysts for greater depth, and not to be sources for mediocrity. And as I said, it'll be up to us.
I'm going to insert before that, probably the last question coming up, maybe two more. The issue came up at lunch, what is my singular identity? And you just gave me the key to it when you talked about fundamentalism. I'm identified as a Lutheran, and somebody asked, what kind of Lutheran are you? I think they meant, what synod? And my answer to that is, I'm a fanatic Lutheran. In the spirit of Mr. Dooley, the Chicago newspaper invention of an Irish Catholic. I shouldn't try the brogue with Jim here, but he defined a fanatic as something who knows he's doing exactly what the Lord would do if the Lord were also in possession of the facts. So I got mine. You're on next.
Question for James Carroll. Two-part question. What changes have been made in the Roman Catholic Church since Vatican II? And how is the current Pope different from Pope John the 23rd?
Thank you for that question. Two things. No, really, two things. How has the Catholic Church changed since Vatican II? Well, let me just put on the table one extremely important change. The Roman Catholic Church has become, against all odds, a peace church. Second Vatican Council is part of this. Certainly Pope John the 23rd's major encyclical of 1963, Pacem in Terris, Peace on Earth, is part of this. But before Pope John, the Catholic Church was the custodian, centrally in Western culture, of the just war theory. The just war theory was used in generation after generation to justify whatever war the powers that be wanted to wage. I believe in the importance of the just war theory, don't misunderstand me, but it was misused, and the Roman Catholic Church was complicit in unjust wars in many ways. And in my youth, the Catholic Church was aligned uncritically with the American side of the Cold War that did not help, as the United States of America, for all of its virtue over against Stalinism, pursued this mad, insane, completely immoral nuclear arms race that resulted in the accumulation of more than 100,000 nuclear weapons. The Catholic Church has stood powerfully on the other side of this. The Catholic Church condemns the American Catholic bishops in 1984. Pope John Paul II and Pope Benedict, as Cardinal Ratzinger, have been firm opponents of all of America's wars. America is the center of a war-making impulse in the world today, and the Catholic Church has been its consistent critic. That is the most important change in the Catholic Church since Nostra Aetate. And I would credit, for all of my liberal disagreements with the establishment, Vatican establishment, this has been a very clear message. And I would say, I said in my remarks, the Catholic Church is having an argument with itself. Churches, an institution like this old, this big, doesn't change quickly or easily. And when the stake of change is planted in the ground, human beings have to, over time, understand what it means and adjust how they live with it. So the most important example of that was Nostra Aetate, because Nostra Aetate was a profound shift in doctrine in relationship to the theology of salvation. In the old days, you had to be a Catholic to go to heaven. Then liberals started to say you didn't have to be a Catholic, but you still needed Jesus. So you couldn't get to heaven without Jesus, and you could get to heaven without Jesus, but actually, by baptism of desire, you really had Jesus but didn't know it. This whole notion of getting to God. Well, the affirmation of the covenant God makes with Israel in Nostra Aetate is the wedge that breaks open that theology. And the Church has been wrestling with it since. And it's been back and forth and back and forth. So the American Catholic bishop said 4 or 5 years ago, the Catholic Church is no longer includes among its purposes the conversion of the Jewish people. That's a logical follow-up on Nostra Aetate. And then a few months ago, instructed by the Vatican, the Catholic bishops issued a clarification of that, which is the Vatican word for we made a mistake there, but we don't make mistakes, so we'll call it a clarification. And now they seem to be advocating the proselytizing directly of Jews. It's confusing. It's 2 steps forward and 1 step back, or 1 step forward and 2 steps back. This is the way the Church changes. Cardinal Ratzinger has been a force for defense of the medieval Church. Since Vatican II. He was a liberal at Vatican II, but he had a reaction to it. And as Pope Benedict XVI, he's been less conservative than he was as Cardinal Ratzinger, but still a defender of the medieval Church. But Pope Benedict XVI marks the end of something, not the beginning of something. The reform movement of the Roman Catholic tradition, part of the larger reform movement of the Christian tradition, again, all post-Holocaust, because the Holocaust was the revelation of basic change that had to happen. All of this is underway, and it won't stop, in my view, because of this pope or that pope. We're on the train toward a reformed and renewed Christian faith.
Because you're loud. Because our time is up, we have 2 questions. Would you both state your question and see if they can? Wouldn't it be interesting if they overlap and intersect? Microphone.
There's one right over here if you can. Here's one. This is working. Mr. Carroll, as a positive influence on the Catholic Church, you stated several things, but one of them you stated was that the rejection of society in general to Humanae Vitae was a positive thing, and yet in Humanae Vitae, Pope Paul VI stated that rejection of this teaching and acceptance of contraception worldwide would lead to greater child abuse, abuse of women, greater divorce, violence in general, and abortion. How do you see that as a positive?
Well, I simply disagree with that analysis of the effect of contraception. It's very clear from the experience of men and women that family planning, the humane decision-making process according to which people take full responsibility for their families, is a plus. It's a blessing. So that's part of it. The larger context, of course, is that we're living through a massive cultural shift in our time that we don't fully understand. The meaning of human reproduction has changed. Contraception is new. The idea that the Catholic Church has always condemned contraception is foolish, because until the 19th century, there wasn't any such thing as reliable, consistent contraception. That's a modern phenomenon. And it's been a boon. And let me just say two other things. One about AIDS and the other about abortion. There's a bishops' meeting, a synod going on in Rome right now of African bishops. The Vatican position on the use of condoms, forbidding the use of condoms even to help with the prevention of AIDS, is a deeply, deeply misguided, I would say immoral thing. Africans are dying because of it. Second, as a Catholic who affirms with my church the importance of lowering abortion rates, I believe in contraception. The way to lower abortion rates is to advocate for contraception. The church, and let me just say, the church is speaking on this question because the Catholic people themselves are the church. And the vast majority of Catholics, not just in this country, but certainly in Europe and increasingly in impoverished parts of the South, are making their own decision on this question. The hierarchy has created a terrible bind for itself, ironically trying to protect the hierarchy of the church and its authority. The teaching on contraception has done more to undermine it than any other single thing. And the truth is, the world needs the authentic, wise teaching authority of Catholicism as part of what we do to deal with these great questions.
Thank you. And last one.
My question is very similar to the question of the previous questioner. So I'll state my question, but I think Professor Carroll has already answered it to a large extent. And it's this. Do you have any words of encouragement for Catholics and those of other faiths who experienced the excitement and hope of Pope John XXIII and Vatican II, but have since been dismayed by the restoration, in quotes, brought about by subsequent popes?
Well, for those of you who are not Catholics, you think of yourselves as watching a kind of tennis match, right? We Catholics are in a tennis match with ourselves, and it's it's not that much fun, actually. But I've said this. I believe that the renewal of the Church began so powerfully under Pope John XXIII, a figure who is the greatest pope of all in my view. But the Second Vatican Council wasn't just the work of one man; it was the work of all of the bishops of the Church. And if you have any doubts about the commitment of the Catholic Church to modern ideas and democratic principles, go back and read the documents of the Second Vatican Council. And tonight, I'm going to put the text of Dignitatis Humanae, a couple of paragraphs from it, on the screen so that we can look at it closely. This was not the act of a couple of liberal theologians who were on the margin of the church, or a couple of, sort of disgruntled ex-priests like James Carroll. This was the act of the most solemn teaching authority that the Catholic Church has. The Council stands above the Pope. Oh, you say, but the Pope is infallible. Well, who said the Pope is infallible? The Council. The teaching authority of the Church at its highest is the Council. The Council has put put down it's like the U.S. Constitution. They put it there, and the people who follow them in this nation have to constantly deal with it. And it's a text that lives, and the Catholic people have embodied it. Go to any, you don't have to just go to liberal campus ministry centers on universities where it's guitars and Bob Dylan. Go to any Catholic parish. The sermon you hear may be a conservative or anti-modern or disgruntled sermon, but the Catholic people who are at that Mass are there because the sacrament is alive. The new liturgy, that's the Vatican II liturgy, is meaningful. It's the emblem of the new democratic structure of the church. The people have taken this church to heart in a way that's unprecedented, at least in modern times. And I see it all over the place. And there are Catholics here who disagree with me, but there are Catholics, the ones who disagree with me have heard these arguments before, and I have myself been changed by the argument itself. I'm much more careful about some of the tradition than I used to be. I was careless about some of it more than I would be today. This church is alive and well, and the proof of it is the ferocity of the argument we're having with ourselves.
In about 15 minutes, a bell will ring.